The book of Jude's a very short book, and yet it's a very pointed book. It's a book that deals with an issue that was mentioned earlier in the New Testament about 2 Peter, where Peter also, especially in chapter 2, talks about a problem involving, I believe, these same individuals. Peter says they're coming. Jude's saying, well, they're now here. And Jude is in reminding these believers how to respond. Jude adds a couple of details that I think will be helpful as we look at this today, because what we're talking about, and this is the classic passage that people turn to for this idea of contending for the faith here in Jude 3, contend for the faith. That means you need to get out there and fight for Christian doctrine. Fight for Christian doctrine. Don't let anybody take down Christian doctrine. And I don't think that's really what Jude is talking about. And I think we actually miss something that is far more important than our entering into a debate with, well, normally really unsaved people, because they're normally the ones that destroy or make a mess of Christian doctrine. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we're talking about this word that's translated contend. Some places it's translated fight, it's translated strive, it's translated struggle. Notice here in Jude, verse 3, dear friends, although I was very eager to write to you about the salvation we share, or some Bibles have the common salvation, wouldn't you have loved the whole letter about our common salvation? But, he says, I felt compelled. I felt it was actually necessary to write and urge you to contend for the faith that was once for all entrusted to God's holy people, or to the saints. It was the old word. Holy people maybe is maybe a better idea. I still think maybe there's even a better way of looking at it. Maybe the people, God's people who he has set apart. But then you'd have to explain that. But this is for us. Now, when he says contend, we have this for the faith that was once for all entrusted. This idea to contend for, and that's a legitimate way of translating this. We don't have a word for in there. We have a form of the word the faith that he puts in here with a bunch of other things attached to it. And that form can be taken, it's what we call the dative form in the Greek, and it could be that we're doing it on behalf of it. It can be a fancy way we put it in grammar. It's a dative of advantage. You're doing this for the advantage of the faith. So you're contending or fighting for the faith. And as we talked about it, I think at the outset of these set of studies, is that the form of agonize or struggling or fighting here that he uses has a preposition on the beginning that, well, we take it in a perfective sense, meaning really fight, if that's the way we understand this. Having said all that, and I've been trying to demonstrate this in the previous videos, I believe that when Jude is writing this, I don't think he's talking about them arguing with the people that are going to be the problem. Rather, Jude is saying, you know what to do? When you have these guys around, you really, really need to deal with your Christian faith. You need to focus on the promises God's made you. You need to really focus on them. Should you focus on God's promises daily? Yes. Are they promises that you should be really relating to all through your life? Yes. But you know what? Sometimes you're going to face some opposition. You're going to face some people that are going to really mess something up in there. And you personally have to really, this is the way I would put it, you need to really live your Christian life. You'd say, well, this isn't the word live. Yeah, you need to really struggle in your Christian life. And some people would say, the Christian life's not a struggle. Really? There is times it's a struggle. There are times that we face challenges, and it is hard for us. It's hard for us to keep our head in the game. It's hard for us to respond and think clearly about the things that we've heard and come back and say, that is not what God says about my Christian life. Now, this is what goes on. This is why they need to do that. For certain individuals whose condemnation was written about long ago, literally of old, and I believe that goes back probably 10 to 15 years earlier when Peter wrote 2 Peter before his death. that they have secretly slipped in among you. They didn't come with a banner going, hey, we're going to change up what Peter and Paul taught you. No, they slip in secretly and like, hey, yeah, we're part of you and this. And then they are, he says, ungodly people. Now, we've talked about this word ungodly before, but it's a hard word in the Greek. It's a word that really means a person dishonors God. And how would you dishonor God today? By basically telling lies about him, basically telling him where to get off the bus. And says, so these are ungodly people who pervert. Now, I chose the NIV because I think that's a good translation. They have changed. They've shifted something about the grace of God. A lot of translations just have, they've turned the grace of God. Turn's okay. I think it has less punch. Pervert's probably a little bit interpretive. But I do think it gets at the point. They're perverting the grace of our God into a license. There actually is no word for license here, but I agree that's probably the sense for immorality. And this isn't just any immorality. It's a form of immorality that's like a public display. They don't care who knows. They don't care who sees. It's like they're there just to parade the way they live. And he says, they're going to say the grace of God makes all this okay. Now, that's exactly what Peter tells you when you read 2 Peter 2, except over there, Peter leaves out the idea of the grace of God there. He's just saying these people have twisted the Christian life. They've messed it up where they are trying to convince even Christians, hey, it's okay to be immoral. God's good with it. It's grace. It's all good. We're under grace. It's all good. God doesn't care how you live. Be immoral. Peter tells us over there, part of their goal of doing that is, well, when they get together for your feast, when you guys share together meals at church, they're checking out your wives and your daughters. And he says, do you really want those guys among you? Furthermore, not only did they twist the grace of our God into license for this type of blatant immorality, but they also deny Jesus Christ our only, this is sovereign Lord. Why do you think he uses this emphasis on his being sovereign Lord? Because they're saying, he can't tell me what to do. I'm under grace. No, he still has charge of our lives. He's looking out for us in ways, we're so stupid. He's looking out for us when we're not smart enough to look out for ourselves. So he goes on from there. He says, though you already know all this, I want to remind you. In other words, it's not like he's telling them something they don't already know. I want to remind you that the Lord at one time delivered his people out of Egypt, but later destroyed those who did not believe. And there's several places where Israel did that and God punished them. But one of the times he punished a bunch of the people was when they were engaged in immorality among themselves. And another time when they were engaged with the women from one of their neighboring nations in sexual immorality. And in both of those instances, God destroyed quite a few people. So, again, an immoral thing. And then he says, and the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, or could even be their proper way of dwelling. The ending on the Greek word would suggest that also, that he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. We'd say, who are these angels? I personally think that these are sons of God. You may really disagree with this, but I believe that these are sons of God in Genesis 6 that came down. They took the form of men, obviously, although I believe that the people knew that they were these angels in some way or another, and they took for themselves women for wives, and they produced a bizarre offspring. And people go, that can't happen. The Bible says they don't marry. Yeah, the angels of God don't marry, but these weren't the angels of God. These were Satan's angels, and they did something they weren't supposed to do. He says they abandoned their proper dwelling. That's not the way they were supposed to be, but they abandoned that. And they went after, really what they did is after other flesh. And he says, in a similar way to this, Sodom and Gomorrah also and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. See, all three of these, he's using these examples, all three of these situations involve people that were immoral. Well, spirit beings and then the others people. And he says, this was a serious thing. And he says, you guys need to really live the Christian life because, well, As Peter warned and as Jude's going to warn, believers can get sucked into it. Now, maybe you won't. Maybe you're mature enough you won't get drawn into their nonsense. But you need to be really living that Christian life for the sake of others who might get drawn into this. At the end of Jude, one of the things he says is, sometimes you got to run in and you got to grab that believer out of the fire. Hating what they've got involved in, hating how it's messed up and soiled their clothing because they've gotten involved in this. And you need to go in there and get them out and say, this is not the way God's designed us. This is not what God's grace is about. Which then brings us to Titus chapter 2, a passage we've been to many, many times here in this channel. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation towards all men, instructing or child training us to deny or say no to ungodliness. That very word that we had over there, that really ugly term. That I believe one of the ways that these people flaunt their disregard for God, flaunt their dishonoring of God, is they don't live the way God desires them to live. God desired us to be a man and a woman, and these people carry on in a promiscuous, open fashion. And that was not the way God designed you and I as believers to live. In fact, we have a promise in Galatians chapter 5, verse 16. Very simple promise. But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desires or the cravings of the flesh. How do you walk by the Spirit? You follow his lead to your position in Christ. You say, wait a second. I've been freed in Christ. I've been freed from the sin nature. I haven't been freed to sin. I've been freed from sin. I died with Christ to that very sinful nature. I was buried with him, and I am now risen, and I'm living unto God. That's Romans chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. And that's where the Spirit leads you. You walk by the Spirit by following his lead. And you know what? What Jude's talking about, if we go back up to verse 3 and we have this word contend, and I think Christians miss this very point, that they want to be engaged in arguing for the Christian doctrine, that what he's telling them is it's not about arguing with unsaved people to get them straightened out on the nature of Christian doctrine, on the doctrine of the Trinity or the doctrine of the church. It's about you personally in your own life. If it's necessary, struggling, really focusing on this conflict so that you do not succumb to that perverted teaching about the grace of God and give yourself over to, in this case, sexual immorality. Because that's not what God has something so much better for you than giving yourself over to that perversion, that twistedness. And it's not the grace of God, no matter how many times they tell you it is. Grace of God frees us from sin. It does not free us to sin. That's what I really think Jude verse 3 is about. And I think we've missed a very important passage and a very important thing. If this is struggling for Christian doctrine, I'd like to know what the rest of this letter is about, because that interpretation of this statement doesn't match the rest of what the book of Jude is about. It is about how these people live and perverting the promises of God, and specifically the promise with regard to God's grace. That messes people up. It's like Hymenaeus and Alexander in 1 Timothy. It causes a shipwreck to the faith. Or in this case, it's like a person getting in a burning building and you have to go in and pull them out, as he says towards the end of this book. So are you as a believer struggling with the sin nature? And we all will at times. And it may not always be with sexual immorality, but that's a very common one. Sometimes you're going to have to really struggle in the faith. I would say not for the faith, but struggle in or by means of the faith, those promises that God's made to you and I. I hope this is helpful. I found this to be exceptionally helpful to me many years ago to understand what this was. I used to be one of those guys that wanted to argue doctrine. And we're going to come back and talk about the whole issue of arguing doctrine in upcoming studies here. But for the time being, just take away the important thing. This is about you really, shall we say, really living the Christian life, really focusing on God's promises to you and I as New Testament grace believers. So as always, have a good day in the Lord, and thank you for joining me.